Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of After Crime. Today, we're diving into the top 10 most wanted criminals in US history. Some of the most notorious names you'll ever hear about. And trust me, you won't want to miss the last one. It's an unbelievable story. So, grab your seat, stick around till the end, and let's jump right into it without wasting any time. First names come in this series is the name of Thomas James Holden. Imagine being the most wanted man in America. Your face plastered on newspapers and FBI posters nationwide. This was the reality for Thomas James Holden, a man whose life of crime spanned decades and made him one of the FBI's first public enemy number one. 1 inch. Holden wasn't always a notorious figure. Born in 1896 in Illinois, he lived a quiet life until he decided to break bad. In the early 1920s, Holden joined up with notorious bank robbers and entered the world of organized crime. His specialty? Robbing banks and trains, a skill he perfected with deadly precision. Alongside his partner in crime, Francis Keating, they formed a gang that terrorized the Midwest. But Holden's life of crime wasn't just about money. His violent tendencies soon escalated. In 1930, he was convicted of murder during a botched robbery. Sent to Leavenworth Penitentiary, it seemed like Holden's story might end there. But that wasn't the case. Holden and Keating escaped from prison in 1932, sparking a nationwide manhunt. But even freedom couldn't tame his violent streak. After years of dodging the law, Holden's most shocking crime came in 1949, when he brutally murdered his wife and 2 brothers-in-law in a fit of rage. These brutal murders finally landed him at the top of the FBI's most wanted list, the very first man to be named public enemy number 1 by the newly established FBI under J. Edgar Hoover. Holden was a fugitive for nearly a year, hopping from city to city, hiding in plain sight. But in 1951, his luck ran out. An anonymous tip led the FBI to his hiding place, and after a brief struggle, Thomas James Holden was finally captured. Thomas James Holden was a career criminal, but his legacy was cemented in history not just for his heists, but for the violent end to his criminal reign. He may have lived in the shadows, but his name will forever be remembered as a notorious symbol of early American crime. Thomas James Holden, a criminal mastermind whose life of violence and escape still echoes through history. Boston's underworld has seen its share of criminals, but none were as feared or as protected as James Whitey Bulger, a man whose life was a whirlwind of violence, betrayal, and power. In just 2 minutes, we're diving into the dark legacy of one of America's most notorious mobsters. Born in 1929 in South Boston, Whitey grew up surrounded by crime. By his teenage years, he was already running with street gangs, committing theft, and getting into trouble. After his first arrest at 14, Bulger would soon step up his game. In the 50s, he was involved in everything from bank robberies to arms smuggling. After serving time in some of America's toughest prisons, including Alcatraz, Whitey returned to Boston with a new goal: to control the city's underworld. In the 1970s, Bulger became the leader of the Winter Hill Gang, a powerful Irish-American crime syndicate. Under his rule, the gang thrived. Extortion, drug trafficking, loan sharking. Whitey did it all. And if anyone stood in his way, they disappeared. At least 19 murders are tied to Whitey. His preferred method? Ruthless, up-close violence. He wasn't just ordering hits, he was pulling the trigger himself, sometimes killing people with his own hands. But Bulger wasn't just a brutal gangster, he was smart. He became an FBI informant, feeding them information on his enemies while continuing his criminal empire. For years, he played both sides, untouchable, with law enforcement turning a blind eye. In 1994, when his double life was exposed, Bulger disappeared. For 16 years, he was a ghost, America's most wanted fugitive. But in 2011, living under a fake identity in Santa Monica, California, Whitey was finally caught. He was convicted of 11 murders, racketeering, and extortion. Sentenced to life in prison, the man who once ruled Boston streets spent his final days behind bars. In the shadows of the world's most dangerous conflicts, one name rose to the top: Osama bin Laden, the mastermind behind the deadliest terror attacks in history and the face of a global war on terror. But how did one man go from a wealthy upbringing to becoming the world's most wanted terrorist? Born in 1957 into one of Saudi Arabia's wealthiest families, bin Laden was once far from the life of a militant. But the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 changed everything. Osama joined the fight, using his wealth and influence to recruit fighters for the Mujahideen. It was here, in the mountains of Afghanistan, that bin Laden first tasted power. In 1988, he founded Al-Qaeda, an organization that would become synonymous with terror. Bin Laden's vision? A global jihad, targeting Western nations and their allies. In 1998, Al-Qaeda launched its first major strike: the bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. Over 200 people were killed in the coordinated attacks. For bin Laden, this was just the beginning. In 2000, bin Laden's men attacked the USS Cole, a U.S. Navy destroyer, in Yemen, killing 17 American sailors. But the world would soon come to know bin Laden's name in an even darker chapter. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda hijackers, under bin Laden's orders, carried out the deadliest terror attack in history. 4 planes, coordinated strikes. The Twin Towers fell. The Pentagon was hit. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost. Osama bin Laden became the face of global terrorism overnight. In response, the US launched its war on terror. And bin Laden? He vanished, hiding in the rugged terrain of Afghanistan and Pakistan. The US government placed a $25 million bounty on his head, dead or alive. For years, the world's most powerful military searched for the world's most elusive terrorist. After nearly a decade of hunting, the trail finally led to a quiet compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. In the dead of night on May 2, 2011, U.S. Navy SEALs stormed the compound. Osama bin Laden was shot and killed in a brief but decisive raid. Osama bin Laden's death was a victory for justice, but his legacy of terror had left a deep scar. From the embassies in Africa to the heart of New York City, bin Laden's crimes changed the course of history. He was the mastermind of global terror, a man who reshaped the world with fear. Osama bin Laden may be gone, but the shadow of his actions continues to haunt us. A man walks onto a plane, carrying nothing but a briefcase and a mysterious smile. Hours later, he jumps into the night sky, never to be seen again. This is the legend of D.B. Cooper, America's most infamous skyjacker, who pulled off one of the greatest heists in history and disappeared without a trace. It was November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving. A man identifying himself as Dan Cooper bought a one-way ticket from Portland to Seattle on Northwest Orient Airlines. To the crew and passengers, Cooper seemed like just another business traveler, calm, polite, unremarkable. But what came next would become the stuff of legend. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper passed a note to the flight attendant. She thought it was just a flirtation, until Cooper leaned in and said the words that would change everything. "I have a bomb." Inside his briefcase, Cooper revealed a bundle of wires and red cylinders, convincing enough to make the crew follow his demands. He wanted $200,000 in cash, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck waiting in Seattle. If his orders weren't followed, he threatened to blow up the plane. In Seattle, authorities scrambled. Cooper's demands were met. He got his cash, the parachutes, and allowed the passengers to leave. But his plan was far from over. With only the crew on board, Cooper ordered the plane to take off once more. Somewhere over the Pacific Northwest, at 10,000 feet, he did the unthinkable. Cooper opened the rear stairs, strapped on a parachute, and jumped, vanishing into the stormy night with $200,000 strapped to his body. Search teams combed the rugged terrain of Washington and Oregon, but Cooper was gone. Not a trace of him, or the money, was ever found. The man who pulled off the perfect heist had vanished, leaving behind only questions. Who was D.B. Cooper? The FBI launched one of the largest manhunts in history. Over the decades, suspects emerged, theories flew, but the truth remained elusive. Was Cooper a seasoned skydiver or a reckless amateur? Did he survive the jump? Or did he die somewhere in the wilderness, buried with the cash? In 1980, a boy found $5,800 of Cooper's ransom money near the Columbia River, sparking more questions than answers. But Cooper himself? Never seen again. No arrests. No body. To this day, the mystery of D.B. Cooper endures. The man who hijacked a plane, stole $200,000, and jumped into legend. Was he a criminal mastermind or just lucky? No one knows. And maybe we never will. In the midst of the Great Depression, when banks held the fortunes of a struggling nation, one man became the face of American crime. John Dillinger, America's most wanted man, a bank robber who became a folk hero for outsmarting the law at every turn. Born in 1903, John Dillinger grew up in the Midwest, but it wasn't long before a petty theft landed him behind bars. And prison? It was a school of crime. Dillinger learned from hardened criminals, emerging not just as a thief, but a mastermind. In 1933, Dillinger burst onto the scene with a string of bank robberies across the Midwest. Armed with Tommy guns and fearless determination, he hit banks in Ohio, Indiana, and beyond, taking tens of thousands of dollars while the country watched in awe. Dillinger wasn't just a criminal, he was a showman. His robberies were precise, fast, and daring. He'd enter banks, demand cash, and disappear into the wind, leaving police in the dust. And every time the law got close, he slipped through their fingers. But what really cemented Dillinger's legend were his escapes. Twice he broke out of prison. In one of his most famous escapes, he used a wooden gun he had carved himself, tricking guards and walking right out of jail. His ability to outwit the law made him a legend. By 1934, Dillinger had become America's most wanted man, with the newly formed FBI hot on his trail. As his list of crimes grew, so did his fame. To the public, he was a modern-day Robin Hood, a man sticking it to the banks, even as law enforcement called him a dangerous killer. But even legends fall. On July 22, 1934, Dillinger was betrayed. After months on the run, the FBI tracked him down to the Biograph Theater in Chicago. With the help of the Lady in Red, an informant who tipped them off, Dillinger was cornered as he stepped outside the theater. That night, John Dillinger was gunned down by FBI agents. His reign of crime was over, but his story was far from forgotten. John Dillinger, bank robber, escape artist, and American outlaw. To some, he was a villain. To others, a folk hero. But one thing's for sure, his life was one of the greatest crime stories ever told. They were young, wild, and in love. Together, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow tore across America in a whirlwind of crime and chaos. Bank robbers, killers, and lovers, their story captured the imagination of a nation in the throes of the Great Depression. But it was a love story destined to end in blood. Bonnie and Clyde came from humble beginnings in Texas. Bonnie, a waitress with dreams of becoming a poet, and Clyde, a small-time thief. When they met in 1930, it was a love at first sight that would change their lives forever. Together, they became the most wanted outlaws in America. From 1932 to 1934, the Barrow Gang, led by Bonnie and Clyde, waged a 2-year crime spree across the Midwest. They robbed banks, grocery stores, and gas stations, making off with thousands of dollars. But they weren't just thieves. When cornered, they didn't hesitate to shoot. Their crime wave left a trail of bodies in its wake. At least 9 law enforcement officers were killed by the Barrow Gang, and Clyde in particular became notorious for his trigger-happy nature. Yet, despite their violence, they were seen by some as modern-day Robin Hoods, striking back at the corrupt system during the Depression. Bonnie, often seen as Clyde's loyal sidekick, was just as tough. Her image, holding a cigar and a pistol, became iconic. But she wasn't just a gun moll, she was a poet. In one of her last works, The Story of Bonnie and Clyde, Bonnie wrote about their lives on the run, almost as if she knew their end was near. In May 1934, that end came. After months of eluding capture, Bonnie and Clyde were ambushed by law enforcement on a rural road in Louisiana. Armed with automatic rifles, the officers opened fire, riddling their car with over 100 bullets. Bonnie and Clyde died together, in a hail of gunfire, just as they had lived, side by side. They were outlaws, lovers, and symbols of rebellion. Bonnie and Clyde's violent, passionate lives became the stuff of legend, proof that love can be just as dangerous as crime. In the heart of Mexico, a legend rose, a kingpin of crime whose empire spread across borders and oceans. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the man who became the face of the drug trade, was as cunning as he was ruthless. But how did he go from a poor farmer to the world's most notorious drug lord? Born in 1957 in a humble village in Sinaloa, Mexico, Guzman grew up in poverty. His rise began when he entered the drug trade as a teenager, working under the Guadalajara cartel in the 1970s. But it wasn't long before he seized control for himself. In the 1980s, after the arrest of his former boss, Guzman took over the Sinaloa cartel. He was a mastermind in the drug trade, using sophisticated networks to transport massive quantities of cocaine, marijuana, and methamphetamine into the United States. By the early 1990s, he was a billionaire. But Guzman's empire was built on blood. As rivals sought to challenge his power, violence escalated. His cartel was involved in countless murders, kidnappings, and corrupting officials. The body count rose, and El Chapo became known not just for his wealth, but for his brutality. In 1993, Guzman was arrested, but that didn't stop him. In 2001, he famously escaped from a Mexican prison, hiding in a laundry cart. His escape made headlines and solidified his reputation as a master of evasion. For over a decade, he eluded capture, living a life of luxury while orchestrating drug shipments. He was a ghost, one step ahead of law enforcement, always plotting his next move. But in 2014, after a dramatic escape from a second prison, Guzman was finally caught again in 2016. The world watched as he was extradited to the US, facing charges that would expose the depth of his empire and the violence it wrought. In 2019, Guzman was sentenced to life in prison for his role in a massive drug trafficking operation that caused untold suffering and death. But even in captivity, his legend continues. One man's rise and fall reshaping the landscape of crime forever. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, an outlaw, a kingpin, a symbol of the drug war. His story is a cautionary tale of power, greed, and the price of ambition. In the heart of America's intelligence community, a traitor lurked in plain sight. Aldrich Ames, a name that would become synonymous with espionage and betrayal. But how did a loyal CIA officer turn into one of the most damaging spies in American history? Born in 1941, Ames joined the CIA in 1962, quickly rising through the ranks. He was seen as a promising officer, trusted with vital intelligence operations against the Soviet Union. But beneath this facade of loyalty lay a desperate man, driven by greed and ambition. By the late 1980s, Ames found himself in financial trouble. With a growing appetite for a lavish lifestyle, he made a fateful decision. He began selling secrets to the KGB for cold, hard cash. Over the next few years, Ames leaked the identities of numerous American spies and informants in the Soviet Union. His betrayal was catastrophic, leading to the execution of at least 10 CIA assets and the dismantling of several key operations. The ramifications of Ames's actions were felt far and wide. As the Cold War reached its climax, the intelligence community was rocked, trust shattered, and the hunt for the mole began. In 1993, after years of investigation, authorities finally closed in on him. They had gathered enough evidence to prove that Aldrich Ames was the mole, the traitor who had sold out his country. In 1994, Ames was arrested and later sentenced to life in prison without parole. His betrayal had caused unimaginable damage to American intelligence, and the trust that had once existed was forever altered. Aldrich Ames, a man who chose wealth over loyalty, transforming from a trusted officer to a notorious traitor. His story is a chilling reminder of how far one might fall when seduced by greed. In the summer of 1996, as the world gathered in Atlanta for the Olympic Games, a sinister plot was unfolding. Eric Robert Rudolph, a man who would soon become notorious for his deadly actions, was lurking in the shadows, plotting chaos amid the celebration. Born in 1967, Rudolph had a troubled upbringing that would shape his radical beliefs. He became deeply involved in the anti-abortion and anti-government movements, believing in violent action to advance his cause. But it was the Olympics that would serve as his deadly stage. On July 27, 1996, the heart of Atlanta was rocked by an explosion at Centennial Olympic Park. The bomb killed 2 people and injured over 100. Panic swept through the crowd as chaos erupted. Rudolph's message was clear. He would stop at nothing to make his beliefs known. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few years, Rudolph would carry out a series of attacks that showcased his twisted ideology. In 1997, he bombed a women's clinic in Birmingham, Alabama, killing a police officer and severely injuring a nurse. Rudolph's attacks continued, culminating in another bombing in 1998 at a gay nightclub, injuring several people. Each crime was a calculated move to instill fear and promote his extremist views. For years, he evaded capture, disappearing into the mountains of North Carolina. The FBI placed him on their 10 most wanted fugitives list, but it seemed he was always one step ahead. In 2003, after more than 5 years on the run, Rudolph was finally caught. His reign of terror had ended, but the scars of his violence lingered. In 2005, he pleaded guilty to multiple charges, receiving 4 life sentences without parole. Eric Robert Rudolph became a symbol of domestic terrorism, a reminder of how radical beliefs can lead to unimaginable violence. And that's how the incredible story unfolds. What do you think? Will there ever be another like it? If you want more fascinating tales like this, hit that subscribe button and join me for the next dive into the world's most captivating stories. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious.